for another of the sessions from St Wilfrid's English Hub with myself. I know some of you have been on the other ones and some of you haven't. The sessions kind of stand alone, but they also complement and work together. So if you are on tonight but haven't accessed the other sessions, that I'm sure the English Hub or myself could make sure that you gain access to these recordings if you want them. So this evening we're going to talk about vocabulary, and we're going to talk about vocabulary skills. And without wanting to sound sad, this is probably one of my favourite topics in the world of speech, language and communication. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit kind of theoretically about how children learn words, but we're also going to talk about what that means practically, easy things that we can tweak and introduce into our practice, talk about things that you're probably doing already, but particularly things that we have to consider when working with children who find the learning of vocabulary a little bit slower, a little bit more difficult, where we as practitioners and as leaders have to think a little bit more about those children, about what their skills are like and about what they need. So hopefully there'll be things to take away for all of your children, because all young children are learning vocabulary and developing vocabulary skills all of the time. But of course, as always, when I do things, we will have a little bit more of a focus on those children with developmental needs and our more vulnerable children. So let's kind of just orientate ourselves to a couple of things that are kind of going on in that kind of bigger background world of education. And as we will all know, there is that kind of push and that drive to be thinking about knowledge, to be thinking about building knowledge. And certainly for those of you who work in schools, less so possibly in settings, it's that notion of linking what you're doing in the early years to the curriculum in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. What words do we want the children to know in nursery and then in and kind of like, how do we build knowledge progressively? And that's not a bad thing. But what I want to just kind of throw in there, as somebody who has been a teacher, but whose primary background is speech and language therapy, that when we talk about knowledge in that way, what we're actually really talking about is building vocabulary and building vocabulary skills. As we share experiences and teach children as they learn new words in this topic or this curriculum area that we're talking about, and as they connect those new words with words that they already know, that connection enables them to retain that vocabulary. And then maybe a day later or a week later, we can ask them about what they know about such and such a subject. And with their vocabulary skills and then their expressive language skills, they can tell us, they can remember what it is. So although we talk about knowledge, we cannot think about knowledge without thinking about language skill and vocabulary skill in particular. And the other kind of big buzz phrase that's kind of been out there for a long time now, particularly in relation to areas of deprivation, is about this notion of the word gap, that children from deprived homes are all individual children. Of course they are, but statistically speaking, they are found to know less words than their contemporaries, from their peers from more affluent homes. And we talk about word gap, and I think that research is right. It's for a variety of reasons, but I also think it pushes us into this notion that the vocabulary issue is simply one of vocabulary size, and that what we need to do to close the word gap is simply to increase the number of words our children know in order to close this word gap, which is based on this concept of vocabulary size. And hopefully, and we do need to do that, don't get me wrong, but hopefully what we'll investigate a little bit this evening is that closing the vocabulary gap is a little bit more complex than that. And it's not just about increasing vocabulary number, it's also about fundamentally increasing vocabulary skill and the links between words, and considering how children and how different children learn words differently. So let's get started. So let's begin by thinking about your role when it comes to vocabulary. And I think when it comes to vocabulary, we are trying to do two things. And we're very well aware, because of what we've just talked about, this word gap, that we have got a role for vocabulary expansion, teaching children new words, words that they don't know. They might be words that they don't know about familiar topics, but also words that they don't know yet about new topics, more abstract topics. This is our role, not just in closing that vocabulary gap. This is a fundamental part of what we do as teachers and as practitioners. So vocabulary expansion is a really kind of strong element. But also the other element of your kind of remit is to be building vocabulary links between words that the children already know, so that they're linked together because of common meaning. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But also, as we develop links and better links and more intertwined connections between the words that children already know, teaching new words becomes easier, because then they can slot that new word into these existing connections. And I think it's important that we are thinking about our vocabulary practice as a combination of those two things. And if we can do that, then we're pretty much getting it right. So these vocabulary links that I am talking about, if I think about some children that I've worked with in the past, as a teacher, but also as a therapist, I've known children who have had really quite large vocabulary, but they've struggled with these connections between words. And then I've known children who have got a much smaller vocabulary, but they've got really strong connections between those words. So they know that water goes with wet, and it goes with wash, and it goes with bath, and it goes with kettle, and it goes with pour, and it goes with puddle, and it goes with splash, and it goes with all of these other words. Do you know what? If I had the choice to teach either the child with the smaller vocabulary but well connected, or the large vocabulary with no connections, of course I would want to teach them both. But I would take the connections over the lack of connections any day, because it's the connections between words that play such a fundamental role in our thinking and our thought processes. So of course, size is important, but it's the connections that we shouldn't underestimate, because those connections play a fundamental role to children's imagination and their creativity. So we find that children with language delay and children with language disorder can often find imaginative and creative play difficult, or be delayed in those areas of play. Vocabulary connections will underpin children's ability to generate ideas, to find words, to make connections between things, to solve problems. It will be the connections between words that will allow children to begin to infer and to predict. It will be those connections that will give the children ideas of things to write about. And also it's connections that underpin our thinking skills. And when an educational psychologist assesses children for their IQ, for their verbal intelligence, it is their vocabulary and their vocabulary connections that are assessed in order to give a measure of verbal IQ. So they're pretty important. So I'm not saying vocabulary expansion is not. I'm just saying we all know about vocabulary expansion already. I'm just trying to reinforce this notion of vocabulary links as being equally as important. So, but let's talk about vocabulary expansion first, and hopefully this is kind of very kind of common practice to you. This is some things that you will be doing all the time, but what I'm going to do, as always, is try and just kind of put my little spin on things to help us to consider and reflect those children where vocabulary expansion is a bit more difficult. Because let's face it, if we have got children who have got age-related language skills, if they're interactive, if they're already coming to us with a level of understanding, a level of vocabulary that's well connected, of course we've got to put in effort. We've got to interact with them. We've got to provide them with a learning environment. We've got to provide them with those rich experiences. But to be quite honest, building their language and building their vocabulary is relatively easy, because the children have got those skills in place already, and all we're doing is fueling that process and building it on. We have to think a little bit more, though, when children are not in that position, and that's what we're going to do right now. So the first thing to think about is that vocabulary is almost like your central store in your language mechanism. Theoretically, it's called your semantic system, where you store words based on what they mean, and you connect them together because they go together because of commonality of meaning. And that is why it plays such a crucial role to our thinking. But when it comes to building vocabulary, particularly where children are not meeting age-related, we cannot think about just vocabulary. So we cannot, in our school or in our setting, have a vocabulary strategy that doesn't consider children's other language skills. So the first thing that I need to think about is, in order for me to build vocabulary, in order for me to add new words into this vocabulary store, what are the child's input language skills like? So in session 2, in session 1, we talked about early communication. And in session 2, we talked about children's listening and understanding skills. If to build vocabulary, I need to engage a child in an interaction, be it a one-to-one interaction, be it a small group, be it a larger group interaction, depending on how I'm communicating with children, I need to see, do they have that ability to engage with me? And then if they do they have the ability to listen to and to process the sentences that I am using? Because it is only at that point, if they can, that I can begin to add that new word. If, as I'm talking, they're not able to process those sentences, and a lot of the language goes over the top of their head because their auditory memory cannot keep up with what I am saying, then I haven't been successful at expanding children's vocabulary, because they haven't been able to process what I'm trying to add. So all the time, we're not going to kind of unpick it, because if you want to unpick this, go back to the other 2 sessions if you weren't there at them to begin with. But I have to consider, as I'm adding vocabulary, to build vocabulary with different children, how do I need to interact with them? Who still needs me to be face-to-face with them on their level? Who still needs me to be using exaggerated facial expression with lots of visual support? Who can cope with me speaking in longer sentences where the new words are embedded alongside a lot more words, but who still needs me to use much shorter sentences, and then to leave a chunk, a chunk of language with that new word in, to leave a gap, and then to repeat that chunk of language again, because I'm giving them an input of language that is easier for them to process. And by being easier to process, it's going to be easier for them to store that new words. So vocabulary is a separate kind of area of language development, but if our way in is utilizing auditory and other language things, and is underpinned by the child's skill to to be able to engage and interact with people, then we cannot build vocabulary without considering those skills. So when we're building vocabulary, obviously the output of vocabulary building is that children use words themselves. They use words to name things, to describe what they're doing, to talk about what things are like. So I think in schools and settings, we're very used to listening to children, of course we are, and making note of the words that children use or that children don't use. But when it comes to considering vocabulary skill and building new vocabulary, you've almost like got two phases of vocabulary learning. When you take a new word, the first kind of point will be for me to use the word with the child again and again and again, to the point where a child can understand its meaning, and then to use it again and again and again to the point where the child can begin to use it themselves. Now, with children who are strong language learners, with a new word, they can go through this cycle of not knowing a word to understanding a word to using a word just like that. You know, you can have one little interaction, one little conversation about the name of a new piece of fruit or about the name of a new animal in your farmyard area, and before you know it, they know what it is and they're using it themselves, because the number of repetitions that the child needs to hear in order to go through this cycle is very low. For some children, that's not the case, and the number of repetitions that they need in order to store that word and understand that word and then to use the word can be much more significant, and there can be a time delay between understanding the word and using the word. And it's important to kind of realize that some children just need more input to move on to the next stage. And when there is a time lag between the receptive language and the expressive language, and we know they know what it means, but they're not using it, what we really want to avoid is falling into what I call the what's that trap. You know the child understands it, but they're not using it. You want them to use it. So you create opportunities to try and get the child to say it. But I think with all of these things, we need to remember that continuing to add language, to continue to be a word feeder and not a word retriever, particularly with children with language delay and language difficulties, can be much more productive, because when they are ready to use that word, they will use that word. So within all of this, as well as thinking about what children's interaction and what children's understanding skills are like, you know, for all of our children, you know, what's their vocabulary learning behavior like? And some of the observation checkpoints within the new development matters are sneakily asking us to look at that, as in how children learn new words, and are children interested in learning new words. So again, this is something that we're probably thinking about already, but you know, how many words do the children use? And if they don't use a lot of words, is it that they understand lots of words but just don't use many? Or is their understanding of vocabulary delayed? How quickly does a child learn new words? And fundamentally, do they seek vocabulary learning opportunities out? So if you look at a 2-year-old provision, for example, and you take children who have got that predisposition to that strong early start with language skills, you can see that they seek out vocabulary learning opportunities from adults. They'll hold things up and go, or they'll walk an adult round a room and point things. They're wanting to hear the word. They're almost like asking for the input, if that kind of makes sense. So we can get this really positive spiral with children whose language skills are already strong, that because they seek out vocabulary learning opportunities, their vocabulary gets fueled and fueled and fueled by the practitioners. But children with language delay or with language disordered kind of characteristics to their developmental profile don't do that type of thing. And therefore, it's our role as practitioners and as leaders to identify that, to kind of flag that up, and to kind of think, it's only me as an adult who's going to be able to redress that balance, and to think that I've got to be the one to kind of be offering that input and creating those embedded intervention opportunities for that child, whereas some children create their own learning opportunities because they start the ball rolling. And the last thing to kind of just say is also to be aware that normally when a child uses a word in their expressive language, you can kind of say, well, they're bound to understand it, because if they didn't understand it, they wouldn't be using it. But just be careful of children who repeat a word or a phrase back after somebody else has said it. So they've used it in their expression, but they haven't actually generated it from their vocabulary store themselves. Be aware of children who use learnt phrases that they kind of just churn out as if they're, and they've got different words in, but they're not actually proper kind of sentences that are made. And just be aware when children use a word in one way, but only ever in that way, but they never generalize it out to other ways, that just because you've heard that word come out of a child's mouth, some children can be a little bit more complex. So we should never completely, with every child, take a use of a word as a measure of understanding. But again, those children will be causing you little bits of concern in other ways, and so you will already be thinking a little bit more closely about them. So let's think about our practice and how we teach words with all children. So in early stages of language development and in early years practice, the reason why we get a whoosh of language within early years is because of two main reasons. The first is because neurologically, children have that window of time of brain development where it's the prime opportunity to learn language. Of course, that is a big reason. But the other reason is because the way we teach in early years is all about multisensory experiential learning. So we add the vocabulary within our interactions with children, but that is usually alongside what we're doing. So as we're sharing experiences, exploring the learning environment, carrying out our daily routines, doing a very specific focused activity, yes, the child has language, and that's how they learn that language, and by hearing it, but they also are looking at the things that we're talking about. So the words match most of the time what they can see, and they're also using stuff. So if we're talking about something being smooth, or if we're talking about something being rough, or if we're talking about how that's a long ribbon, then the child can not just see it, but the child has a chance to experience and feel that as well. And that's why it is such a rich environment for learning words. And also as well, we must remember that at the early stages of language development, repetition is crucial. So that notion of we might be using these resources, but we're saying the same small bank of words again and again and again as we explore these resources. As children's language skills move on, we might begin to use more words and to repeat less. But where you've got children who are not as strong at learning vocabulary, we need to remember that saying less, but saying it more often, being repetitive, is a really crucial part of our toolbox. So sometimes with concern, oh, I need to teach them this, I need to teach them that, I need to be that, sometimes to kind of have that narrower focus, to say less, to not spread yourself so thin vocabulary and language wise, but to have a narrower focus and to say those things again and again and again can really be beneficial. And then later on, as children move through the schooling system, as they get older, and also a little bit in the early years as well, as children get stronger language skills, we build vocabulary by using language. So we introduce language, we introduce a new word, and then we talk about what it means. We reference words that the child already knows, and we explain it, and we talk about how it's nearly the same or how it's a little bit different. It's like that, but it's like, in order to help them understand what this new word means. So with a young child, you know, they might never have had a strawberry before, and you would want them to see a strawberry and taste a strawberry and have symbols of strawberries in the home corner, and then have pictures in books, so that as they heard the word strawberry, there was that visual, that experiential, and ideally that ability to smell and taste them as well. But if I had an older child who didn't know what a strawberry was, again, I could create those experiences. But if they knew other things, I could talk to them about, well, it's red and it's a piece of fruit and it's a bit like this, but it's a bit like, and as long as they knew what those other words mean, I can give them an idea of what a strawberry is like. Fundamentally, it would be better if I could show them as well, but I can begin to use language to help children learn new words. What we have to reflect on and consider as we begin to make this shift is, do we know what words a child knows already, what words a child understands already? So if we're using other words within an explanation to teach them a new word, are we sure that they understand those words that we're using in our explanation? And we just need to kind of consider these things very, very carefully. And my experience will always say, don't assume too much. So I think, just again, in terms of your general practice, if you're just in early years, this is less of an issue, as opposed for those of you who might kind of move into kind of reception key as things get a little bit more kind of adult led over time, and then into key stage 1, if children have ongoing vocabulary gaps, is we have to kind of say, do the vocabulary learning opportunities we create for a child with gaps actually match the best way that that child would learn vocabulary? And that's why I am a real big fan in Key Stage 1 of still having that element of continuous provision where possible, so that for children who still need that visual, that experiential, they still get opportunities to have those interactions and to have those vocabulary learning experiences. And if we are using explanations as we introduce new words, we need to be really careful about how we choose the words that we're using, how we scaffold that process of teaching new words, and where possible, create opportunities for visual support if we're thinking some of these words the child might not understand, so my explanation, some of it's going over the top of their head anyway, then where possible that visual support will sort that out. So again, these are just some principles to think about and to consider. And as I've always said before, where vocabulary learning is more problematic, are you being repetitive enough? Does the child need you to narrow your focus? And with the best intentions, are you trying to build too much vocabulary at the same time with children? And I've even, when I taught in a foundation unit, we even had a child with kind of more significant needs where we had 4 target words, where we chose more, we chose car because he was really interested in cars, we chose toilet, and I can't even remember what the other one was. Anyway, it'll come back to me in the middle of the night tonight. There you go. And what we did was, of course, we used other words with him, but where possible, we created deliberate opportunities where he could hear more, or where, we played with the bubbles and there was the word more, or at snack time, we would give him a couple of little things and then, oh, some more, lots of opportunities where we used other words as well, but where those were our 4 target words. And he was kind of a much more kind of extreme example, but we all have or have had children like that. And it's about kind of saying, do we really need to kind of say, if we put lots of focus efforts into these 4 words, will that be enough to metaphorically tip us over the edge with those words? And for other children, we don't have to think that specifically, but I do think we need to think a little bit more about which words we're teaching, which is what we're going to talk about next. So when we're building vocabulary, I think we all notice when children don't know what things are called, when they don't know what animal vocabulary is, they don't know the names of the fruit that we're having at snack, blah, blah, blah. It's very obvious, and that is really important to build that noun vocabulary. And I think we all also know the importance of that concept vocabulary that will underpin children's ability to describe what things are like, but it will also underpin such fundamental parts of their learning. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have an inclusive but progressive approach to vocabulary, which I'll talk about in a minute, but that we also facilitate a breadth of vocabulary, ensuring that we're building not just too much of one word type, but that we're building different types of words. Now, in my world, I know some people talk and think about it differently, but in my world, I like to think about vocabulary as 3 main types of words. And that really helps me when I'm thinking about what children's vocabulary skills are like, but it also, as I'm interacting and as I'm constantly reflecting and thinking about, for want of a better phrase, what words should come out my mouth at this moment in time, what would be the best thing that I could say to build this child's language skills. It helps me to think about making sure that I create this balance between these 3 types of words. And where children have got gaps with vocabulary, it helps me think about, do they find all words difficult to learn? Do they find some words easier to learn than others? And if they've got vocabulary, is there a breadth of vocabulary, or is it mainly one type of word that they have, in which case I've got to make sure that I create that balance. So of course nouns are important. So nouns can name whole objects, whole pictures, whole things. So if we were thinking about the example of a flower, for example, the flower would be what would name the whole thing. Or a car would name a car. If we have other nouns, though, they may allow us to label parts of that object. So with a car, it might be the wheels, or the door, or the engine, or the windscreen wipers, or, to be honest, that's about where my knowledge of cars kind of ends. But never mind. If we're talking about flowers, then it might be sort of the petals and the stalk and the leaves. And obviously we could get into that GCSE A level vocabulary if we wanted. But even with young children, it's that idea that there are parts to a flower or a pen has got a lid, an ink, etc., for example. And then we've got categories, which so what abstract nouns are nouns that might label a group of things like animals or transport, or a flower would be in plants, for example. And again, in education, we sometimes call those things concepts because they're a bit more abstract, but in reality, language-wise, they are actually nouns, but they name a group of things. And then we have more specific names. So the flower might be a daffodil, for example, or the pen might be a biro or a felt tip. So again, we need to know that the first step is for the child to know that a car is a car, and for the child to know that a flower is a flower. But that even before I teach them other new stuff, they've also got vocabulary to learn within that as well, and on top of that. And that's important. So it's about thinking about building vocabulary, particularly noun vocabulary, it's about that building of new words and new things, new pictures, new objects, but it's also teaching them more words about what they already know. And that will really support their vocabulary development, their reading comprehension in the future, their writing, but also just from a little bit basics. You know, when you're a bit older, oh, can you pass me that pen? Somebody pass you, oh, no, not that pen. I want the sparkly pen with the silver top. And but you know, it allows you to clarify meaning. And so we think that, oh, it doesn't matter if they don't know these part words, but actually in life it does matter. And so I think when it comes to noun vocabulary, I'm not going to say an awful lot, because I think we're all really good at this already. I think the main messages were about just be careful about how you interact, how you add those words in terms of how long your sentences are, remembering to be repetitive and to focus on less when vocabulary is learning, but also where children do make progress and do learn what a word is. Again, don't think, oh, vocabulary learning has ended there. They know what a flower is. Here's an opportunity to add the specific name, or they know what a flower is. Here's an opportunity to draw attention to the little parts and what they're called, so that within an interaction, vocabulary is a constantly upscaling, progressive cycle that I, of course, want to reinforce words that children already know, but I also, when they already know it, think, okay, here's an opportunity for me to add in something new as well. But for other children, it's about going right back to the basics, having that real narrow focus, being really repetitive. Why bother building when we haven't got the basics? So it's that having that balance between an inclusive, but also that progressive edge to vocabulary as well. So one of the word types that honestly I talk about all of the time, when I die, on my gravestone, I honestly think it will say, here lies Kirstie Page, who used to talk about verbs quite a lot. Because the group of vocabulary, the group of words that are verbs, are often the poor relation of our interactions. But from a language learning and a progression point of view, they are so fundamentally important. You know, a lot of children who I've worked with in the past, who might have a small bank or even quite a lot of words, but they're stuck at using single words. They're not beginning to link words together into phrases or sentences. So many of those children have got a vocabulary bank that's primarily made up of nouns, and what it's lacking is verbs. So in order to help them move into sentences, we have to model sentences where we're short, simple sentences, where phrases even, where we're using verbs alongside nouns, but also by doing so to build that verb vocabulary, not just so that they know more words, but so that we can tip them over the edge into beginning to link words together. And also, learning verbs is so crucial because it allows children to form sentences, but it also allows children to say things that they want to say, so that they can tell you about what they're doing. You know, describing activity is one of the main reasons I want to talk when I'm a young child, to talk about what's happening. And later on, and certainly after the age of 3, if language is going well, I should also be able to tell you about what I'm going to do and what I did before, the ability to talk out of the here and now. But fundamentally, I want to be able to talk about what I'm doing. And so having that verb vocabulary, that ability to formulate sentences that allow a child to describe activity and to talk about what's happening, it is so crucial and so motivating. And so that's what we need to do. We need to be aware that we need to, within our interactions, be doing a lot of that ourselves, talking about what's happening, talking about what we're doing, talking about what somebody else is doing. And another really easy thing to build into your practice is, of course, we have books where we share stories, but sometimes to look at books, particularly books where the pictures are slightly busier and there's a little bit more going on, and to talk about, you know, just what's happening in the picture. What are people doing? And that is great for building vocabulary. It's so easy to do. It's using stuff that you've already got, being really targeted, maybe with who you prioritize doing that with. I mean, don't get me wrong, do it with everybody, but there'll be some children that you'll want to kind of like really kind of flag them up for that type of opportunity. And not only is it great for building vocabulary and verb vocabulary and modeling sentences, but talking about what's happening in pictures where you're lifting you and the child are using your visual skills to lift activity off the page is one of the earliest ways you can nurture inference skills. So it's just a really good thing just to build into your repertoire. You take some Key Stage 1 children who have been identified as having reading comprehension problems, and you try talking about busy pictures with those Year 1 children. Many of them will find that problematic. They might name what they can see in the picture, but they'll find it difficult to lift meaning from the picture and to talk about what's happening, or to talk about where somebody is going or what might happen next. So that's kind of really kind of interesting to say, as we're doing those type of things and as we're building language, we're also nurturing very specific skills that will underpin reading comprehension. We have to remember that literacy preparation isn't just about getting ready for phonics. So, I mean, this is all about just doing what you're already doing, and at most tweaking some of your interactions and kind of going back and saying to your team, verbs are really important, and then you can become another person like me who just talks to everybody about how verbs are really important. But just again, you've got all the resources you need, you've got all the opportunities you need. You don't need specific resources, you certainly don't need specific pictures to look at and to cut out, and you know take different areas of your provision. Your Play-Doh, your home corner, things outside. You might not want to do this with every area all at once. You might want to do one area at a time. What are the verb opportunities that area creates for us? The area creates the opportunities and the resources create the opportunities, but we have to utilize those opportunities by adding the language. Think about your daily routines, all of those kind of What are the verb opportunities every day when we're washing our hands or when we're having our snack? Or and again, what are the basic words? What are the less familiar words? So that even our children, with the basic language already established, we've got that concept of being able to move them on. Yeah, so just kind of seeing your learning environment as opportunity creators, and that as a team you see those opportunities, and by identifying them, reflecting on them and talking about them in practice, it then just kind of comes automatically. It's not always about lots of planning, getting lots of things ready. It's about really kind of in that moment utilizing what's going on, but you've done the thinking beforehand and also at the moment of saying those things. So when it comes to verbs, it's a bit like I said with the nouns, it's important to be inclusive. So who needs us to just focus on the basic verb and to keep saying it again and again, rather than trying to build lots of different verbs all at the same time? But where children kind of have the basics, how can we keep that interaction going, kind of acknowledge and firm up that basic, but then use the interaction as an opportunity to build their verb vocabulary on? So I'm not going to go through every, but I suppose if we were outside looking for stuff, you know, the most basic, what are we going to find? Oh, what can we find? Oh, yes, we found this. But then if my children already know find, you know, then I might not say, oh, well, we'll stop doing that activity now. I will still do that type of thing, but now we'll be searching, we'll be exploring, we'll be discovering, we'll be uncovering. Does that kind of make sense? So that within that environment, I could be doing a very similar, we're outside looking for stuff, but as I talk to different children, not only do the length of my sentences get differentiated or backtracked, but also maybe the words within those sentences get differentiated depending on who I'm talking to. But what I do is I make sure that I keep that progression going. And the only reason that I kind of keep talking about this is if you, like me, like I used to, work in an area where you have quite a lot of children who have got speech and language and communication skill gaps, you are very, very used to the need to go back, the need to backtrack, the need to simplify, the need to go back and put the basics in. But I think what we sometimes do is we forget to then move on. So it's important that if we've gone back, that once that's established, we're then saying, right, okay, well, now we're building. We've gone back to put in the foundations, but now we're building. And I think it's so simple, but it's kind of, it can be difficult to manage when you've got lots of children with need. So like I've already said before, if you're going to take one thing away from tonight's session, focus on verbs, but we are going to talk about other stuff as well. So again, concepts is something in education that we're used to thinking about. Concepts are words that are more abstract and they allow us to describe quality. That could be to do what something looks like, feels like, sounds like, how it moves, what it tastes like. It could be also positions of position and size and quantity. So they're more abstract words. And I think we're really good at working on them anyway, so I'm not going to say an awful lot. But where I am going to say something is obviously about where children have got language delay or language disordered needs, and just to be careful about over teaching concepts in opposite pairs. So if we think about teaching long and short or big and little, For example, when children are at age-related expectations, when we teach those opposites, generally those children are already bringing to our activity an existing understanding of what one of those means. So when we're doing long and short, they'll probably have an existing understanding of long, which we need to firm up. But then we can utilize that existing understanding of long to teach them short, if that kind of makes sense. So we're teaching opposites, but we're not fully teaching opposites because the child already knows mainly half of the opposite, and we're using that knowledge, that existing knowledge, to teach the less familiar, the later half of the opposite. Where children have got language learning issues, where it takes a lot longer for them to learn vocabulary, it can be a lot more productive to just focus on one, and to focus on the one that generally comes first in development. So if we were talking lots about wet and dry, we would focus on wet and repeat the word wet. Oh, that one's not wet. Oh, this one is wet. Or if we were doing big and little, we would focus on things being big. Oh, that one isn't big. This is a big. So that you would be kind of reflecting normal development, where the child would generally learn one part of that opposite pair first, and you would narrow your focus, be really repetitive, try to get that earlier word in first, and then when that was in, you would kind of move on to the other one. And I think the other kind of thing just to bear in mind when language learning is more problematic, and particularly children with language disordered profiles, is that concepts can be used in different ways. So that, you know, and that's what can make them quite difficult. So, you know, if I stand next to my mum, for example, then my hair is longer. I've got quite long hair compared to my mum. But if I stand next to most people, then I've got short hair. So concepts are difficult because they can change depending on the situation, if that makes sense. Whereas nouns are much easier because they're much more concrete. A chair is a chair and it's always a chair. Whereas concepts can kind of change and fluctuate. But the other thing is concepts can be used in different ways. So, you know, we can talk about long and short, a long train, a long ribbon or a short ribbon, which is usually to do with the length of something that you can see. But we can also talk about long sounds, you know, a sound lasting for a long time, or a piece of music lasting for a long time. So that long isn't just about something that you can see, it could also be about something that you could feel, or about time. You know, we did that, we played that for a long time. So that when we're teaching concepts, we have to make sure that we teach the concept in multiple ways, but also in multiple modalities as well. And a really kind of important kind of pre-literacy one is words like up and down, those directional concepts. When we use them in play and everyday activities, we talk about going up and down the slide, moving the streamer up and down. Fabulous language enrichment. But up and down in everyday life is in the vertical plane. We go up and we go down. I also want to make sure that I talk about up and down as we're chalking on the floor, or as we're making marks or drawing, because when I'm making marks, be it with a pencil, be it with some chalk on the floor, up means to push the chalk or the pencil away from me, and down means to pull it towards me. We should still be saying up and down because that's what we say, but it's important that I see that When we move a child into writing and reception and we're talking about letter formation, okay, they've got to understand up and down, but they've got to understand up and down, not in the vertical plane like we do with the slide or the streamer. They've got to understand up and down in that horizontal plane when we make marks and draw, and later on when we write and form letters. So in the early years, it's important that I've built that concept, but I've built that concept in those different ways, not just in one way. And do you know what? If you've got a child with strong language and you've only built it in one way and you've missed the other way out, you don't need to worry because they'll be fine. But where children have got language gaps and disordered language patterns, the fact that you've been very narrow and taught them to understand it in one way, but not in that broader way, can be problematic because they find it more difficult to generalize that concept into other types of meaning and to be flexible with their understanding. I also just want to quickly mention the complexity of vocabulary as well, in that it would be so easy if one word meant one thing and that's the only thing that it meant. But language is not like that. And particularly the English language is not like that. And I think further up schools were very aware when a word can mean different things and then that affects how it is spelt. But actually, there are a lot of words that can mean different things, but that the spelling remains exactly the same. And our main priority is that children understand that some words can mean different things, or that some things can be called different things. So when we're enriching children's language, we need to almost like just draw attention when we're using a word in one way that the child might already know in another way. So say, for example, I don't know, we might be talking about sliding a cupboard door, or sliding something on a resource. And we say, oh, we know the slide, don't we? We have a slide outside. Or, oh, you've got a slide in your hair. This is a different slide. This slide means, does that kind of make sense? So we should very much use words in their multiple meaning ways, but we should also make sure that we don't kind of skirt over it, that we actually draw attention to it. And again, just little things like, a bat is a nocturnal creature, for example. So if that's one of our very words in phonic preparation or early phonics, bat, and it might be that in our phonics scheme, we've got that represented as a picture of a nocturnal bat. But it's also important that a bat is something that you can hit a ball with. And a bat is also a verb as you use that bat to bat away the ball. So that it's very important that we, if we're just because we're focused on phonics, we don't lull children into the kind of false sense of security that this word means this and then that's all it ever means, and that we can use those as opportunities to talk about, oh, it's the same word but it can mean this. Yeah, and that's particularly, I think, important when children are new to English, that we teach them those anomalies in our language. And also just little things like, if you're measuring kind of weight and things being heavy and things being light, and you're saying, oh, what weight? It's like, well, wait is the word that you use when you're asking them to wait for a turn or to wait for a minute because you're busy talking. And I think we have to kind of be aware and not shy away from that, but to actually say, oh, but this is a different type of weight. This is about things being heavy and things being light. And to actually acknowledge, yes, I've used a word that you've already know as I'm teaching you a new thing, but actually this word means this. And that's so important. And a lot of children who are older who have reading comprehension problems, a lot of the issues is that they know a word, but they know it in one way, but not the way that it was used in the text. And so they read it and interpret it in the way that they know, not in the way that it was meant. So it's important that even in the early years, we talk about what words mean, and we embrace and we talk about when words can mean more than one thing. At the minute, we're not worried about the spelling pattern. We're just talking about it so that children actually understand the words that we use. So that's kind of all about building vocabulary and expanding vocabulary. But I just want to talk briefly at the end about this really fundamental notion of building vocabulary links. So one of the most productive things to think about is the different types of links that a word can have. So if we think about even a basic piece of vocabulary, so if we think about an apple, for example, that the first thing that I need to do is understand what an apple is, and then to be able to use the word apple myself. But then as my language builds, I learn that apple goes together with certain verbs. To begin with, maybe just eat. You eat the apple, but then you can bite it and you can chop it and you can peel it. And later on, I'll learn that you can grow it and you can pick it and you can bake it and you can press it. So this kind of connection building doesn't stop in the early years. It goes into adulthood. But what we've got to do in the early years is to make sure that children have those basic connections. And then once they've got the basic connections, we build more connections, but we stagger it over time. I also learned that an apple goes with a topic. So fundamentally, it is an item of food, but then it's also within that subtopic of fruit. Location. Maybe the first thing that I'll learn is an apple goes on the snack table, an apple goes in the fruit bowl, an apple can be found at Asda, or it might be that I already know that apples can be found on trees or that apples can be found in orchards. But that again, remember those early links that I have will be based on my experiences as well. The attributes, which are where concepts come in. So an apple can be an apple is round, it can be red, it can be green, it can be shiny, it can be juicy, it can be sweet, it can be sour, it can be very kind of abstract, healthy. So we've got all of that concept vocabulary that comes in. And then we've got the name of parts. So again, these are nouns, so it would be pips and skin and stalk and all the rest of it. And then I've got those specific names. So it's that idea of, golden delicious or Braeburn or cooking apple or what have you. So I'm not kind of saying that about apple as such, but this idea that this notion of there are different families of how words can go together. And when I'm building word links, it is so easy to build those attribute links where I talk about the concepts that go with this object. I talk about what this object is like. But to be holistic in my vocabulary building and to build those links, I need to remember to build those links with verbs. I need to link in those verbs, that object with the topic it's in, where it can be found, so that when I'm talking to a child about an apple or about anything else, and I'm not just naming it, I'm adding other words as we talk about it, that I have this notion of being holistic, so that what I don't do is only build one type of connection where we know lots and lots and lots of concepts to do with an apple, but that we haven't talked about how we bite it and how we chew it and how we swallow it, and how does that kind of make sense? So we'll come back to this kind of notion when we talk about a few little activities as we run towards the end. But let's just remember kind of some age-related expectations. By the age of 3, I should be able to ask my children to pass me an object by using the verb, the familiar verb that goes with that. So can you find me something to write with? They should pass me the pencil and not the car. Can you find me something to eat? You know, they should pass me an item of food and not a brick, ideally. So, you know, as long as I'm using a basic verb, and I suppose as long as they've got an understanding of that verb, they should be at the age of 3 beginning to connect. You've said a word that isn't the name, but I know that those words go together, so I'm going to select that. And by reception, I mean, this is how much progress happens over a very short period of time. They should be able to play listening for meaning games where I could have objects in my feelie bag. And I say, oh, I've got something with legs. This one's black and white. It lives on a farm. It's an animal. And this one gives us milk. And if I wanted to be really helpful, I might say, and it says moo. So I would be able to, where language skills were strong, play that game where really what I'm doing is I'm going around that kind of link wheel. I'm never saying I've got a cow in my feelie bag. I'm using words that go together with it. An example from each of those different types of links to see whether the child can utilize, can make sense of those and connect those. Oh, right, this is what she's talking about. Earlier than that, I would have to have that object out with a choice of objects, you know, 5 or 6 objects, and I would say that description. And could the child listen to that description, look at those objects and work out which one I was talking about? That's easier when they can see the objects. And then kind of a higher level way would be that the objects will be hidden, and then the child's got to make those connections just with the words. And again, that's what you would call semantic inference. And also as well, by the time I'm in reception, I could say, oh, can you think of 3 things that are red? Or, oh, can you think of 5 different animals? Or can you think of some things that you could open? And children, you know, again, might need to get used to you asking those kind of things, but they should be able to do those things. And you will notice some children frantically looking around the room for visual support, to look for things that are red, or to look for animals, or to look for things and think about, can you open that? Can you open that? Can you open that? Because they're not able to yet search their semantic system just with words and words alone and generate ideas. And what we need to do really in the early years is try and create a few more opportunities to build that. So use language enrichment as your main tool. I think I've already said this, but to consider the words that you add alongside the words, not just to build new vocabulary, but to systematically build those links. And, you know, language enrichment really, really is the main tool that you've got. And the more you can reflect and consider that, you know, that is the creme de la creme of embedded intervention. But also building links. Think about how you store resources. You've already got resources that are in baskets or boxes because they go together in categories. You know, your opportunities are already there. So do you know what I mean? As you get things out, as you put things away, talk about how the fact that, oh, that doesn't go in there because that's transport. It goes in here because this basket is for animals. So that a lot of those kind of links can be made just as you're going about your daily routines. And, you know, you might even want to play about with how you store objects to create additional opportunities. You can create specific opportunities for things that go together. You know, it could be that if I'm doing a listening activity, that I deliberately, you know, put all things that have all got wheels on, or I put things together that we're going to listen to, everyday objects, but where you can open them all, so that although the main activity is that we're going to listen to these things and we're going to talk about that for auditory discrimination, we can name those objects, but we can also talk about how they've got that similarity. And, you know, you don't have to, but this is just something I used to do. I used to have a things that go together table where, you know, to begin with, I might put things that very obviously went together, you know, all animals, or they were all yellow. But again, as time went on, it might be because they all could be opened, or because they all had handles, or because you found them all in a certain location. And certainly we had a foundation unit, and that was just really good for building vocabulary and those links with the nursery children. But for the language-wise more able nursery children, and certainly the reception children, when they used to kind of come in, you know, what else could we put on our table? Can you go find things? Can you go draw me a picture of something else that could go on our table? Or sometimes I would say, can you guess why I've got these things on the table? What makes these things go together? Because I wouldn't give them the link first. And again, you've just got to be careful how much you stretch it with whom, and where you just need to go back to the basics with other children. But again, it's about creating an environment where you talk about what words mean, and that's just a really big part of what you do. And I think we've got so used to this notion of we talk about what words sound like, and don't get me wrong, that's important as well, that we have to reprioritize sometimes in our own heads. We kind of know deep down it's so important, that actually to talk about what words mean is not really as important. It's more important, because if I know that, I don't know, boat starts with a B, but I don't know that it's something that goes on the water, or that it floats, or you can get different types of boats and you can travel in boats, and, you know, knowing that it starts with a B is not going to give me that reading comprehension and writing skill and learning skills that I need later on. So the last thing I'm going to say is about maybe creating a few more specific, what I would call listening for meaning opportunities. And this is so simple if we go back to this notion of noun in the middle, function, topic, location, attribute, part. And I can play this in lots of different ways. So say, for example, I had been doing an activity as part of my phonic preparation or my early phonic teaching, where I got quite a few objects there that all began with B. And the main objective was we were going to name them, but listen to the fact, B, 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 boat, banana, ball, boy. Ooh, you know, we're either just doing your listening skills, or this might be our sound today, or whatever. It depends on where you are. And again, if you're working with the much younger children, you wouldn't be doing that. But again, if I've got those objects out, I could then say, right, okay, this is a language experience as well. And so for some children, I might say, right back to the basics, can you give me the boat? Or can you give me the banana? You know, can they hear that word? And from that choice of objects, can they connect that word to the object? Do they have what you would call single word level understanding of that piece of vocabulary? But where children have got that, so that would be almost like your really kind of starting point. What I could do is I could say, right, I'm going to ask them to pass me one, but I'm not going to say the name. I'm going to say something about it. So at a very basic level, if it was the banana, for example, I could say, oh, could you pass me something that you can eat? If it was the boy, I might say, oh, could you pass me somebody who can walk? So I'm using a basic function, but again, I can ask the same thing, but I could say, can you find me something that you peel and then you have to bite? Can you find me somebody who wears things? So here I'm still using verbs, but I'm using not the most familiar one. Does that kind of make sense? Or, I might say, can you find me one that goes on the water and floats? Or, we can make it as simple or as complicated as we can. But what's important is that I've used that opportunity to do that auditory discrimination where we've listened to that initial phoneme, but we've also used it as a vocabulary enrichment. With these things, I don't always need separate activities to do separate things. I can bring the two together. So here I'm building phonological awareness and auditory skills for the but bit, but I'm also building those links, those semantic skills at the same time. And the last example, which just kind of really is to just clarify how simple these things are, I can tweak things. So if I've got simple lotto games where the children have got boards with different kind of pictures on, and normally we put the little cards in the middle and we take it in turns to pick one, and have you got it on your board? And then fabulous for turn taking, fabulous for building basic vocabulary, fabulous for visual skills, picture to picture matching. But if I want to play it the listening for meaning way, then I keep the little cards in a little feely bag or in the box, and I keep them hidden. And say, for example, I choose the car picture. The first job is to have a quick look around who's got the car. And if it's a certain, I might say, oh, I've got the car. Who's got the car? Can they hear that word without seeing the picture and keeping the picture hidden? That's really important. Can they understand that word? Can they generate a picture of a car in their mind's eye? And then can they match that picture of their car in their mind's eye to the one on their board? That would be the most basic level. And if they can't, I at that point show them the car so that they've got visual support as well. But for most children, that would be too easy. So, I can have the car, and depending on whose board it's on, I could say, oh, can you find me one that you drive and it goes on the road? For somebody else, if they've got the car, I might say, can you find one that's got an engine and you can reverse it? Does that kind of make sense? So the same game can be played over a period of time, and what you say just gets more advanced, but you stay back with the basics for those children who need it. Or you can play that game with a really kind of mixed language ability type group, but you differentiate it by the links that you're expecting children to know and the links that you're expecting children to learn at this moment in time. And so to incorporate more listening for meaning, there's all sorts we could talk about. I could kind of keep you for a week and to talk about this subject, but this is kind of all we've got time for now. But really what I want you to kind of take away, as well as the verb bit, is that you're doing the vast majority of this already. At most, it involves a few tweaks. And that just to remember that vocabulary is learnt primarily in the give and take of daily interactions, daily routines, as you explore resources. And the more that you can reflect on children's skills and think about how you talk in those conversations and opportunities, experiences, daily routines, the more productive you can be. And that, you know, you really are the biggest kind of tool for building a skill, and that interventions can be embedded if we get these things right. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.